Hello, I'm Fox Fairy, and I do art while I break down politics and discourse. All from a marginalized viewpoint, of course. Hey guys, so today we're discussing how transmedicalism is actually beneficial, unlike a lot of people may say. I will be going through all of the different benefits that have been or can be achieved through transmedicalism or transmedicalist-like ideology, and how we can get there. Now, let's get into the video. Okay guys, so I'm going to break down the benefits that would result if the mainstream trans community became transmedicalist into 4 different groups. The political benefits, the benefits for minorities, the economic benefits, and the establishmentary benefits. So let's start with political benefits. The first political benefit is that trans people would be taken more seriously if transmedicalism was the mainstream belief. It'd be a lot easier to explain our identities with we experience a condition that causes us to only feel comfortable when we present, act, or change our bodies to be a certain way. It would make us a lot more medicalized, and thus we would be respected as people who experience a condition. It'd make things a lot easier to communicate. Not only this, but it'd make the center of the discussion dysphoria, and not just simply our identities. So people wouldn't compare us to identifying as cats or dogs, because that's not what's happening. It's a condition that's backed by medicine and science. The second political benefit is that there would be less fence sitters. A lot of fence sitters are fence sitters because they are in support of trans people, but there are certain things that the mainstream trans community claims that they simply can't get behind. Like, anyone is trans just because, or it's about a political movement or a political statement, or that we should abolish gender as a whole. If we take on transmedicalism as a majority, it would get rid of that mentality and make supporting the trans community easier for fence sitters. Not only this, but a lot of them are turned away from ideas like xenogenders, which have been started by people who invaded the trans community in the first place. If we focus on trying to keep these people out of being associated with the trans community, it would lead us to be supported a lot more of the time. The third political benefit is that we could claim ableism in states without trans protections. We could use the establishment to our benefits in political discussions. Like, for example, if people try to outlaw certain trans healthcare, like transition for minors, or transition in general, we could use our transmedicalism as a way to say, hey, you are discriminating against us based off of our psychological condition, our neurological condition, gender dysphoria. We can use the evidence that we found with the brain sex studies and the studies that reveal certain brain activity in relation to gender dysphoria in order to support these claims. And that would give us a big advantage against conservatives in the political fight against our protections. The fourth reason is policies would center trans healthcare, not only claiming ableism, but claiming treatment. We would have less bills that Too Cutes and TERFs share. It would be really beneficial to us. A lot of the medical discussions surrounding around us and treating our dysphoria, that's what we want. That's what the trans community needs as a whole. Because people can make laws that take away your ability to take a certain medicine, but they can't make laws to take away your ability to dress how you want. If they do, then it's become a fascist dictatorship that has abolished the First Amendment. And that's an entire other issue. And yes, we see certain bills and laws like this that create drag bans in public. That is an authoritarian dictatorship issue because America is not a democracy. America is a fascist police state. There would be 6 benefits for minorities. For one, it'd make transition easier for low-income families. For example, low-income families would be able to use Medicaid and other social service programs to be able to access medical care because it would be medicalizing trans issues as a whole, which makes it easier for us to gain access. When not only the main medical community and the main political communities, but the trans communities ourselves recognize our condition as medical and recognize our experiences as medical, it leads us to be able to cover all our transition by Medicaid in every state instead of having to get fancy-ass insurance. There would be a larger prioritization of marginalized people because there would be less people filling up the wait lists. A lot of people who are getting care don't actually need it, and a lot of them don't even have a gender dysphoria diagnosis. That leaves people on the wait list for hormones who don't actually need them. If we take those people out of the waiting list, there would be marginalized people who would be able to go first in that system. Intersectionality has a big part to play with getting gender-affirming care. And if we take the ability for privileged people who can buy their way into getting gender-affirming care first, who don't have diagnoses, then we can open up the gates for marginalized people to get treated first. We can gain more knowledge into trans healthcare if we start medicalizing transness as a whole. This is because too-cutes often fight against certain types of research because they see them as neurosexism or transphobia because they research trans people and their dysphoria in a medical context, claiming that it's transphobic to associate transness with a condition or something to be treated. This makes it almost impossible to do research on trans people with public approval. If transmedicalism is the face of the trans community, suddenly you find that it's a lot easier to do research on trans people, and the floodgates open for learning more about different techniques for surgeries, different ways to administer and different types of hormone treatments, maybe ways to transition without hormone treatments at all, and possibly ways to help with gender dysphoria, maybe even lessening it until you have the ability to transition, helping you cope in the meantime and making waitlists less of an issue. There would be more protection for children and minorities because it'd be a focus on the medical issues that they face. So there wouldn't be people pushed into surgeries and hormones that they don't need. Now, I do believe that minors do have the complete ability and understanding to identify dysphoria, and they should have the right to achieve treatment. However, in a transmedicalist society, these people would have more time to think about their condition instead of just getting an informed consent model and pushed into going to a treatment center and getting hormones as soon as possible. Because some people genuinely don't need these things, and I feel like the detransitioner rate would go down a lot more if the environment was a lot more medical and a lot less social. Because it is medical, not social. Most of the detransitioners that you see walk into informed consent clinics and walk out with hormones. That's just not the way we should go about things. So it's best to have a transmedicalist model where we operate off of a gender dysphoria diagnosis. This would create more open environments for trans people as well, because hospitals these days are already hostile against trans people in some settings. If it was more medicalized, it would be more well known by medical professionals, and this would make medical settings way more open and easier to access for trans people. Transmedicalism automatically pushes the education of and informing of trans people and their existence and their experiences. If you allow people to know that this is a condition that needs respect and is treated through affirmation, you gain open and accessible environments. If we look at most things with a medical perspective, it leads us to have more understanding and respectful environments. Again, for the economic benefits, Medicaid and other insurances would cover transition care more often if it was recognized as a medical issue, which is why it's important to label it as a medical issue, which is the entire goal of transmedicalism. It would also make it more accessible for low-income families in other ways, by prioritizing the fact that this is not a choice and it is necessary care. If there were less detransitioners and less people to consume these materials, the materials would be more available and thus they would be less expensive. They'd have more supply, making them cheaper. We always have a shortage of hormones and doctors who can perform surgeries. If there are less detransitioners that don't need that care, that opens up the gates for people who can't normally afford it to be able to afford it because it's no longer in high demand. There would also be more regulated and high-quality products for trans people to use in their transition. We'd have better hormones available, better doctors available, better dilators and other medical instruments, binders, tape. More things would be unveiled if we prioritize the medicalization of our experiences. The medical community would focus on treating dysphoria as dysphoria instead of dysphoria as a social issue. Because we've learned and we've seen that treating dysphoria as a social issue doesn't alleviate people of it. Medical transition does. And for those who can feel better through social transition, that's perfectly fine. Your success in social transition does not bar someone from finding success in medical transition. But by prioritizing that social transition over medical transition in the grand scheme of the community, it leaves the people who need it to not be represented in the main discussion. It would also make this less of a cosmetic product and more of a medicine, like I've said earlier, which makes it more necessary for people. Economically, things that are recognized as medicines and not cosmetic products are seen as a lot more important for people, a lot more necessary, and thus more insurances cover it and the prices tend to go down in some cases. However, you have to keep in mind that capitalism is kind of fucked, and I'll address that later. Some concepts that would be put into the mainstream would be trans people need gender-affirming care in the same way a diabetic person needs insulin and a person with a walking impairment needs a walking aid. That there needs to be a process to transition that starts with a dysphoria diagnosis, and that research and recognition towards what makes people trans needs to be supported and understood. These are the three main concepts that all of those prior benefits I discussed hinged upon. And these happen to be the three main concepts that transmedicalism wants to push more than anything else, and 2Qism wants to restrict more than anything else. What are some 2Q arguments that may try and paint transmedicalism as negative or a bad thing? And how do we combat those? Because if I'm trying to point out that transmedicalism is beneficial or even benevolent, I would have to counter some of the flaws that other people would point out with it. 1. Some 2Qs may argue that it is classist to require a diagnosis because of diagnosis expenses. In my experience and many others, a diagnosis for dysphoria is not too expensive or too difficult to obtain with medical insurance. Most transmedicalists support public health care, public health insurance, or social health care because we think that transition needs should be met and that transition materials should be accessible, just only to the people who need them. One may point out that in different places, it is harder to achieve a medical diagnosis, and in some instances, you just can't be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. In that case, transmedicalism isn't what's to blame for that issue. The reason for that issue is transphobia. We're only addressing how things become better as a result of transmedicalism, and they do not become worse. These things are not made easier because of too cute ideology, nor are they made better by assuming that gender is a social construct, or by having an informed consent model that doesn't require a gender dysphoria diagnosis. We need to deconstruct the transphobic systems first, and then implement this type of belief system, or implement this type of belief system and then abolish those systems. Because we need a trans-friendly environment under both ideology. A 2Q may argue that transmedicalism is racist because of gender roles and stereotypes or diagnosis requirements. A transmedical system addresses systemic bias and addresses these issues through regulation and action. Because if this is a medical issue, then we need to address racial bias in the medical system in order to prioritize trans care. Because if we're all still transmedicalists, then that will lead us to involve racial inequality in our transmedicalism. We need to solve racial inequality to achieve a transmedicalist utopia. Transmedicalists want gender counselors to be specifically trained for gender counseling. This would make it easier to achieve for racially diverse people because teaching gender as a state of being would encourage more gender counselors and it would separate gender as a condition or as an internal sense from certain constructs like how you dress. We wouldn't operate off of a white middle-class model of how gender is supposed to work because we would operate off of a transmedical model, which has nothing to do with gender roles. Because unlike two cutes, who reduce gender to masculinity and femininity, we make gender an infallible and inchangeable thing that is completely separate from masculinity and femininity. A trans man could dress like a woman. A trans woman could dress like a man. That doesn't change their gender on the inside, and it doesn't change the fact that they experience dysphoria. Under transmedicalist model, certain gender stereotypes and gender roles that apply to white people and don't apply to black people or other races in general would not have as much power, because we would prioritize the fact that they experience gender dysphoria over the way that they present themselves, because it would be given medical context. Some too cutes argue under the capitalist perspective that we need market for trans care because markets are efficient and make things easier to access. For one, this is false. Markets are inefficient and produce inelastic demand when it comes to healthcare. Have you seen the medical markets these days? Do you know how difficult it is to get insulin? Do you know how difficult it is to get inhalers? This shit is expensive. It's like $50 for Plan B, and there is market for all that. Capitalism doesn't support medicine when you use a market system. More buyers also make greater shortages and a great waiting lists. Trans healthcare is not widely available, and it is not something we have a lot of. By creating a market for it, where you have a lot of people who want to purchase trans healthcare as an unregulated product, it leads it to become even more unavailable and even more scarce than it already is. We have a shortage because of too cute ideology, and it's not getting better. Markets also give implicit bias more power because white rich people will get prioritized in waitlists unfairly because they pay more and they can afford it better. They're going to prioritize people who can pay out of pocket over people who pay with insurance companies. And if you make a market for it based off of demand and not off of need, you realize that less insurance companies even cover this type of transitional care. Which leads us to understand that if we don't operate in the sense of a market, there would be more fair requirements, therefore there would be less privilege unfairness. Like I said, there would also be shorter wait lists, which make fairer systems. When there are less people in queue to achieve something, people use less bias to decide who does and doesn't really need this care. If it's not a market, there are less consumers, which makes it more accessible. Like I've said 1,000 times, when there are less consumers, it's more available. When there are less detransitioners, it's more available. When there are lower lists, it's more available. A too cute might argue that transmedicalism is harmful towards NBIN. This is false, actually. Though the common true scum community at this time has a recent spike in NB phobia, this wasn't always the case, and this still isn't the case for a majority of people who quietly exist as transmedicalists. It's just that in most groups, the most chaotic or most radical groups happen to be the loudest and the easiest to find. Most of us just want to exist. However, a transmedicalist mindset would lead us to spend more time researching NBIN and trying to respect and understand NBIN through the pretenses of their dysphoria. The more research we get, we'll more understand them and they'll be more widely accepted by transmedicalists as a whole. However, this is just if we assume that society functions off of the core principles of transmedicalism, which would then make the majority of people, at least who would support the trans community in the first place, who already supported NBIN, more eager to learn more about how NBIN could fit into this model. Alright, that's all I had to say about this subject. It was really nice to talk about, although I've had to re-record this video like 3 times because I keep losing the old video or losing my phone. The recordings are really hard to keep track of sometimes, so I'm sorry that this one came so late. It was higher up in my priority list. Now that you know that transmedicalism is beneficial, you might want to learn more about it. Go ahead and check my channel, as I have a lot more videos on exclusionism as a whole, including transmedicalism. So you might want to look at that and see what I have to offer. I also have a Tumblr where you can check out memes that I post, and a Discord channel where you can talk and discuss amongst yourselves. Although that one's focused around the Gravity Knife gay community, not the transmedicalist community. If you want access to a space with non-radical transmedicalists, go ahead and look at my subreddit, r/nonradtransmed. You can find all of these things in the link tree in my pinned comment below. Thank you for watching. Love you. Bye.